I stood frozen in the main conference hall as Douglas Brennan, our new director, pointed directly at me. 100 employees sat watching. His voice cut through the silence. Frankly, your position is obsolete. The words hit like a physical blow. My face burned. The room went deathly quiet. Then, from the back row, 72-year-old Howard Sterling, our founder, slowly rose to his feet. He walked forward, his eyes moving between Douglas and me. Do you know whose name is on the grant that funds your entire division? Howard's voice was calm, measured. Douglas' confident expression collapsed, his face drained of all color. 6 years, that is how long I had dedicated my life to the Sterling Youth Foundation. I started right out of graduate school with my master's degree in nonprofit management, 24 years old and burning with idealism. The foundation hired me as Community Programs Coordinator, a title that sounded modest but meant everything to me. My job was to build an after-school mentorship program in underserved neighborhoods across 3 counties. I built that program from absolutely nothing. I spent my first year visiting 12 community centers, sitting in folding chairs in church basements and recreation rooms, listening to directors tell me what their kids needed. I learned names. I learned stories. I learned which students had parents in prison, which ones were raising younger siblings, which ones went home to empty apartments because their parents worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. The program grew slowly but steadily. I personally mentored 47 young people over those 6 years. I knew their favorite subjects, their fears, their dreams. I stayed late on Tuesday nights helping with homework. I showed up on Saturdays for basketball games and debate competitions. I wrote college recommendation letters at midnight and made phone calls to financial aid offices during my lunch breaks. My life was modest. I lived in a small 1-bedroom apartment with a window air conditioning unit that barely worked in summer. I drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a crack in the windshield and an odometer reading that had rolled past 200,000 miles. But I didn't care about any of that because the work mattered. Our program had a 92% high school graduation rate among participants. 92% in neighborhoods where the average was 58%. We were changing trajectories. We were changing lives. The Sterling Youth Foundation was founded 26 years ago by Howard Sterling himself. He had made his fortune in tech during the early internet boom, then retired at 50 to focus on giving back. The foundation started after his nephew, a bright kid from a struggling family, dropped out of high school and spiraled into addiction. Howard always said that experience taught him how one caring adult at the right moment could alter the course of a young life. So he dedicated his wealth and his energy to creating those moments for as many kids as possible. By the time I arrived, the foundation had grown to 85 employees working across multiple programs. Our annual budget reached $12 million, drawn from various grants and private donations. Howard was semi-retired by then, but he still attended major meetings and events. You would see him sitting quietly in the back of rooms, observing, occasionally asking a penetrating question that revealed he had been paying attention to every word. Then, 3 months before that terrible all-staff meeting, everything started to change. The board of directors decided the foundation needed modernization and professional management. They wanted someone with corporate experience, someone who understood metrics and efficiency. They hired Douglas Brennan. Douglas was 48 years old with an MBA from a prestigious business school. He came from the corporate consulting world and had no nonprofit experience whatsoever. But he interviewed well, apparently. He talked about disruption and optimization and maximizing return on investment. The board was impressed. They offered him a substantial salary and gave him broad authority to restructure as he saw fit. But feelings don't show up on balance sheets. I need data I can present to stakeholders. I left that meeting with a knot in my stomach that didn't go away for days. The warning signs multiplied quickly after that. Douglas hired 3 new people for something he called the Strategic Planning Division. These positions had never existed before and seemed to duplicate work that other departments already handled. The salaries for these new hires were significantly higher than what long-term employees earned. Douglas began requiring elaborate weekly reports with complex data submissions. My direct supervisor, Patricia, was a kind woman in her 50s who had worked at the foundation for 12 years. She pulled me aside one afternoon in the hallway. "Mindy, watch your back," she whispered. "I don't like what I'm seeing." Other long-term staff members started looking worried too. People spoke in hushed tones in the break room. Rumors circulated about reorganization plans that no one had seen but everyone feared. Then, 1 week before the all-staff meeting, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Douglas had been meeting privately with my program site coordinators. These were the people who ran our day-to-day operations at the 12 community centers. They reported to me, but Douglas was going around me to talk with them directly. Marcus, one of my coordinators who I had hired and trained myself, pulled me aside after one such meeting. His face was troubled. "Mindy, I need to tell you something. Douglas asked me if I thought your position was necessary or if we could manage the programs ourselves without a coordinator." The room seemed to tilt. "What did you say?" I asked. Marcus looked me straight in the eye. "I told him we absolutely need you. But Mindy is asking everyone the same question. Has building a case." I tried to schedule a meeting with Douglas to address this directly. His assistant responded with a brief email. "The director will address all personnel matters at the upcoming all-staff meeting." The dread that had been building in my chest for weeks became a crushing weight. But even in my worst imaginings, I never anticipated how public and humiliating it would actually be. The all-staff meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. Douglas' assistant had sent an email marking it as mandatory organizational update. Every single one of our 100 employees packed into the main conference hall. I arrived early and chose a seat in the third row, hoping to be inconspicuous. My stomach churned with anxiety. Patricia sat down beside me and squeezed my hand briefly. She didn't say anything, but her face was grim. Howard Sterling arrived a few minutes before 9 and took his usual spot in the back row. He always sat there during large meetings, preferring to observe rather than command attention. A few people greeted him warmly, but mostly he just settled into his chair and waited quietly. Douglas began precisely at 9. He stood at the front with a wireless presentation clicker in his hand and a massive screen behind him displaying his PowerPoint slides. For 45 minutes, he talked about organizational evolution and strategic positioning and competitive advantage. He used a lot of business jargon that felt out of place in a nonprofit dedicated to helping struggling kids. But several of the newer employees nodded along, seemingly impressed. Then he got to the part I had been dreading. "Now, let's talk about organizational structure," Douglas said. His slide changed to show a restructuring plan. Several positions were being consolidated for efficiency, he explained. The foundation was moving toward a metrics-driven approach to program management. "We need to be honest about redundancies in our current structure," he continued. The next slide showed my department's organizational chart. There was my name at the top, Mindy Chen, Community Programs Coordinator. Wait, no. My name is Mindy. Just Mindy. My last name is Anderson. But there on the screen was my actual name, Mindy Anderson, along with my photo. Douglas had pulled it from the staff directory. Everyone in the room could see it projected 10 feet tall behind him. Douglas turned and pointed directly at me, sitting in the third row. His finger aimed at me like a weapon. "Mindy, your role as Community Programs Coordinator is, frankly, obsolete." He said it, that word. Obsolete. Like I was an old piece of machinery that no longer functioned. Like I was outdated technology ready for the scrap heap. The room became so silent I could hear the ventilation system humming. Every head turned to look at me. I felt 100 pairs of eyes boring into me. My face ignited with heat. My hands began to tremble in my lap. I wanted to sink through the floor and disappear. But Douglas wasn't finished. "The site coordinators can manage their own programs without a middleman," he continued, his tone dismissive, almost casual in its cruelty. "Your position represents an unnecessary expense of $78,000 annually. That money could fund 3 new strategic analysts who would provide actual value to the organization." My throat tightened. I couldn't breathe properly. 6 years of my life. 6 years of late nights and weekend visits and personal investment in kids who had no one else. 6 years of grant writing and relationship building and problem solving, reduced to an unnecessary expense. A middleman. Obsolete. I glanced around the room. Some of my colleagues looked shocked. Patricia's face was red with anger, but she stayed silent. Some of the newer employees, the ones Douglas had hired, were nodding along as if this made perfect business sense. Marcus, my site coordinator, looked stricken. But no one said anything. No one stood up for me. Douglas moved to the next part of his presentation, explaining how my duties would be distributed among remaining staff members. He made it sound so simple, so logical. He suggested that my programs had succeeded despite my involvement, not because of it. He even implied that I had actually been an impediment, that the site coordinators had been doing the real work all along while I simply took credit and collected a paycheck. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to tell everyone about the student I helped get into college after spending 6 months working with her on applications. I wanted to talk about the night I stayed until 2 in the morning, when one of our mentees called me in crisis because his father had been arrested. I wanted to explain that my job wasn't just paperwork and coordination. It was relationships. It was presence. It was being the one stable adult in the lives of kids who had known nothing but instability, but I couldn't speak. My voice was locked somewhere deep in my chest. Tears threatened to spill over, but I forced them back with everything I had. I would not cry in front of everyone. I would not give Douglas that satisfaction. The humiliation was suffocating. This was my career, my purpose, my identity, and it was being dismantled in front of everyone I worked with. I thought about my student loan debt, still substantial despite 6 years of payments. I thought about my apartment lease. I thought about health insurance and rent and all the mundane necessities that required a paycheck. But more than any of that, I thought about the kids. Who would advocate for them? Who would stay late and show up on weekends and refuse to give up on them when things got hard? Douglas clicked to his next slide, ready to move on to other departments and other cuts. Just as he opened his mouth to continue, a voice came from the back of the room. "Excuse me, Douglas." Everyone turned. Howard Sterling was standing. The elderly founder rarely spoke at meetings anymore. He preferred to listen and observe. When he did speak, people paid attention because it was unusual and because it was Howard. The room became even quieter than before, if that was possible. Howard walked slowly down the center aisle. His steps were measured, unhurried. There was something about his calm that felt powerful. He reached the front of the room and stood beside Douglas, who suddenly looked less confident. Howard was shorter than Douglas, older, dressed in a simple cardigan rather than an expensive suit. But somehow he commanded the space in a way Douglas never could. Howard looked at Douglas, then he looked at me, then back at Douglas. "Do you know whose name is on the grant that funds your entire division?" His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. Douglas' expression faltered. The confidence that had been so strong just moments ago flickered like a candle in wind. What grant?" Howard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The Mercer Foundation grant, $2.4 million over 3 years. It specifically funds your strategic planning division and the 3 new positions you created. Douglas tried to recover. "Yes, of course. I'm familiar with it," Howard continued, still in that same calm tone. "Are you familiar with who wrote that grant proposal?" Douglas looked confused. "Our grants department, I assume." And that's when everything changed. Howard turned away from Douglas to address the entire room. His voice remained steady, almost conversational, but every word landed with weight. 2 years ago, the Mercer Foundation announced a special initiative for youth development innovation. The application process was extraordinarily competitive. The proposal required demonstrating measurable community impact and sustainable program models built on authentic relationships. I sat frozen in my seat, not understanding where this was going but feeling the energy in the room shift. Mindy spent 4 months researching, writing, and preparing our proposal. Howard continued. She documented every success story, every metric, every relationship our community programs had built. She included testimonials from 17 young people whose lives were changed by her direct mentorship. She crafted a narrative that showed not just what we do, but why it matters and how it lasts. Patricia suddenly stood up. Mindy's proposal scored 98 out of 100 points. she added, her voice shaking with emotion. The Mercer Foundation told us it was the strongest application they had received in a decade. They said Mindy's documentation of relationship-based outcomes was groundbreaking. Douglas' face had gone from confident to confused, to something approaching alarmed. "That's excellent work, certainly," he said, trying to regain control. "But the grant funds organizational operations now. It's part of our general budget." Howard cut him off. "The grant has conditions, Douglas." The room held its breath. "The Mercer Foundation requires that Mindy specifically remain as Community Programs Coordinator. It's written into the grant agreement. They funded us because of her demonstrated impact and her leadership. If she leaves this organization or is terminated, we have 30 days to return the remaining $1.6 million. Gasps rippled through the assembled staff. People turned to each other, whispering. Douglas' face went through a remarkable transformation. First red, then white. He fumbled with his tablet, clearly searching for documents he should have read more carefully. "No one informed me of this condition," he said, his voice rising slightly. Howard's expression didn't change. "It's on page 7 of the grant agreement." "Did you read it before planning to eliminate the position it specifically protects?" Douglas said nothing. The silence was damning. But Howard wasn't finished. He pulled a folder from under his arm, one he must have been holding the entire time. "I'd also like to address your comment about Mindy being an unnecessary expense." He opened the folder and began reading numbers. "In 6 years, Mindy has written or co-written grant proposals totaling $8.3 million in funding for this organization. Her community programs have the highest retention and success rates of any youth initiative in the Tri-County area. Last year, 3 of our partner organizations specifically requested to expand their collaborations because of Mindy's relationship management and her reputation for integrity." Marcus suddenly stood up from his seat near the front. "I need to say something," he announced, his voice strong despite the tremor I could hear beneath it. "Douglas asked me if we could manage without Mindy. He wanted me to say yes. But the answer is absolutely no. She is the reason our sites function smoothly. She solves problems before they escalate. She connects us with resources we didn't know existed. She advocates for our kids at every level of every system. Without Mindy, I would have quit within 6 months. This job is hard. She makes it possible." Another coordinator stood. Then another. A youth mentor from our downtown site raised her hand. 3 kids in my group are in college right now because Mindy personally helped them navigate applications and financial aid when their own families couldn't. She stayed with them through every frustrating phone call and every rejected form. She never gave up. Even some of the administrative staff began speaking up. "Mindy always remembers everyone's names. She asks about our families. She helped cover my shift when my mother was in the hospital." The testimonials kept coming. Douglas stood at the front of the room, his carefully prepared presentation in ruins around him. His face had settled into something between anger and desperation. He had lost control of the room completely. In that moment, he made a fatal error. Perhaps it was ego. Perhaps it was panic. Perhaps he genuinely believed what he was about to say. "With all due respect, Howard," he said, his voice tight. "You've been retired for 5 years. The board hired me to make tough decisions that you're too sentimental to make. These emotional testimonials don't change the financial reality that we need to modernize." He had just directly challenged the founder in front of the entire staff. The room seemed to collectively inhale. Howard's expression, which had been calm throughout, hardened into something else. Not anger exactly, but something more dangerous. Certainty. "I see," Howard said softly. "Let me ask you another question, Douglas. Do you know how many board members I personally recruited and still have regular contact with?" Douglas Adams' apple bobbed as he swallowed. He was beginning to realize his mistake. "All 7 of them." Howard answered his own question. "And they will be very interested to hear how their new director planned to violate grant terms, eliminate our most effective program coordinator, and make unilateral organizational decisions without consulting anyone. Very interested indeed." Howard turned to address the entire room one more time. "This meeting is dismissed. We will resume this discussion at an emergency board session." Then he looked directly at Douglas. "A session where you will have an opportunity to explain your decisions." People began filing out slowly, still processing what had just happened. The mood was strange. Shock mixed with something that felt like vindication. Small groups formed in the hallway, whispering. Many people approached me. They touched my shoulder, squeezed my hand, mumbled apologies. I should have said something sooner. More than one person told me. Patricia wrapped me in a tight hug. I should have spoken up, she said fiercely. I should have pushed back harder when he first started this campaign against you. I was scared for my own position. I'm sorry. I couldn't quite process any of it yet. The whole thing felt surreal. Douglas had retreated to his office, his face dark with fury. Marcus and the other coordinators surrounded me, creating almost a protective circle. We've got your back, Marcus said. Whatever happens next, we're with you. But I felt numb. The humiliation was still fresh, the wound still open. Yes, Howard had defended me. Yes, people were saying supportive things now. But where were they 10 minutes ago when I sat alone while Douglas eviscerated me in front of everyone? I tried to return to my office and do some work that afternoon, but concentration was impossible. My hands still trembled every time I thought about standing in front of everyone while Douglas called me obsolete. The computer screen blurred in front of me. I kept replaying the moment over and over, stuck in a loop of humiliation. At 2:30, my phone chimed with an email. From Douglas' assistant. The director requests your presence immediately. My stomach dropped. I considered ignoring it, but that seemed cowardly. I saved the document I had been pretending to work on and walked slowly toward Douglas' office. Each step felt heavy. His door was closed. I knocked. Come in, his voice called out, flat and cold. Douglas sat behind his massive desk, the one he had special ordered during his first week because the existing furniture wasn't impressive enough. He didn't invite me to sit down. He just looked at me with open hostility. That was quite a performance by Howard, he said. His tone dripped with bitterness. I stood there, not knowing what to say. You orchestrated that whole thing, didn't you? He continued. Got the old man to fight your battles for you. No, I managed to say. I had no idea about the grant conditions. I didn't know Howard was going to say anything. Douglas leaned back in his expensive leather chair. Sure you didn't. 6 years of playing the sweet, dedicated coordinator. Turns out you're more calculating than you look. Something inside me shifted. The numbness began cracking, replaced by something hotter. Anger. Clarity. Let me be clear, Douglas said, his voice hardening. The board hired me, not Howard, to run this organization. Grant conditions or not, I will find a way to restructure your position. Maybe you keep your title but lose all your authority. Maybe we discover performance issues that justify termination for cause. Either way, you've made an enemy today, Mindy. And I don't forget. The threat hung in the air between us. But instead of cowering, instead of apologizing, instead of trying to placate him, I felt something new. Strength. I've never been calculating. I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I've been present. I've been doing the actual work while you've been creating PowerPoints about work. You've been here 3 months, and you haven't visited a single program site. You don't know any of our kids' names. You can't name one specific success story. You don't understand what I do because you've never bothered to learn. You called me obsolete, but you don't even know what you're eliminating. Douglas' face flushed red. This conversation is over. Get out. I left his office with my head higher than when I entered. Yes, I was terrified about what would happen next, but at least I had finally spoken truth. That evening, I collapsed on my couch at home, emotionally demolished. But my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Staff members checking on me, text messages of support. Marcus sent a message that made me cry. We're drafting a letter to the board supporting you. 23 people have signed so far. Then an email arrived from Howard. Mindy, would you have coffee with me tomorrow morning? There are things we should discuss. It'll be at the corner cafe at 7 if you're available. Howard. I typed back a simple yes, then sat staring at my phone. Gratitude overwhelmed me. But so did guilt. Did I really deserve this level of defense? Douglas' words echoed in my head. Maybe I wasn't as valuable as people thought. Maybe I had been coasting on goodwill. Maybe. My phone chimed again. Another email, this one from an address I didn't recognize. No name attached. The subject line read, "You should know what Douglas is really doing." I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam. But curiosity won. I opened it. Inside were forwarded documents, internal memos and spreadsheets from Douglas' computer. My eyes widened as I read. These weren't just his notes. These were detailed plans he had been developing for weeks. A massive reorganization that went far beyond anything he had mentioned in the meeting. 8 positions total were marked for elimination. Not just mine, every single one held by staff members who had been with the foundation for more than 5 years. Every single one to be replaced by new positions in his strategic planning division, most at significantly higher salaries. I scrolled through the budget projections. Douglas' plan would actually cost $300,000 more per year than current operations, not less. His efficiency claims were completely fabricated. Then I found something that made my breath catch. A copy of Douglas' employment contract. Buried in the compensation section was a performance bonus clause. $50,000 if he successfully restructured operations within his first 6 months. He wasn't trying to help the foundation. He was positioning himself for a bonus. And eliminating me, destroying my reputation publicly, was part of his strategy to prove his worth to the board. I kept reading. 5 of the 6 new positions he planned to create were already filled with names. People he had worked with at his previous company. This wasn't restructuring. This was empire building. He was clearing out loyal staff and installing his own team. The email contained one more attachment. A news article from 4 years ago about a community health nonprofit in another state. The organization had suffered a dramatic collapse after an aggressive restructuring by their new executive director. Services reduced by 40%. Administrative costs increased by 60%. 2 major grants lost due to program instability. The director's name was Douglas Brennan. Another article. Another organization. 3 years ago. Same pattern. Douglas arrived, promised optimization, eliminated long-term staff, installed new management, claimed success, then moved on 18 months later. The organization was still struggling to recover. The email ended with a simple note. Has done this at 3 organizations. Comes in, fires loyal staff, installs his people, claims success, moves on. Don't let him do it here. From a friend. I sat there until midnight, reading and rereading everything. I thought about taking these documents to Howard, to the board, but would they believe me? Would it look like I was vindictively attacking Douglas after he tried to eliminate my position? Would I seem petty and desperate? Sleep didn't come easy that night, but by morning, I knew what I had to do. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 3 days later. It took place in the foundation's main conference room, the same room where Douglas had humiliated me. All 7 board members sat around the long table. Douglas arrived with a leather binder and his tablet, clearly prepared. Howard sat quietly in a corner chair, present but not at the table. I was asked to attend as well, which surprised me. I sat near the back wall, trying to make myself invisible. Susan Caldwell, the board chair, called the meeting to order. She was a retired banker in her 60s, all business. We're here to address concerns about the proposed restructuring and how it was communicated to staff. Douglas, please present your perspective. Douglas stood and launched into a presentation that I had to admit was masterfully done. He was smooth, professional, persuasive. He framed himself as the victim of resistance to necessary change. I was hired specifically to modernize this organization and improve efficiency, he explained. Unfortunately, some long-term staff members and even our emeritus founder are emotionally attached to outdated structures that no longer serve our mission. He showed charts and graphs documenting what he called redundant middle management. He carefully avoided mentioning me by name, but his implications were crystal clear. Organizations die when they prioritize sentiment over strategy, he said solemnly. My job is to ensure this foundation thrives for another 26 years. Several board members nodded. One even murmured approval. My heart sank. Douglas addressed the grant issue directly. Yes, there was an unfortunate oversight regarding grant language. I take responsibility for not catching that detail sooner. However, I believe we can work with the Mercer Foundation to modify the terms. They're reasonable people. They'll understand our need for organizational flexibility and will maintain equivalent programming even if specific positions change. He made it all sound so reasonable, so responsible, so grown up compared to emotional staff members clinging to the past. The board members looked convinced, Susan said. These concerns seem manageable, Douglas. Change is always uncomfortable, but you make valid points about sustainability. Another board member, a tech entrepreneur named David, added, I agree. Organizations need to evolve. We can't let nostalgia drive decision-making. Howard sat silently in his corner, watching. His face revealed nothing. I felt hope slipping away like water through my fingers. Susan looked around the table. Unless anyone has additional information to present, I think we can move toward, I have information the board should see. My voice surprised me. It came out stronger than I felt. Everyone turned to look at me. Douglas' expression shifted from confident to wary in an instant. May I approach? I asked, holding up my laptop. Susan hesitated, then nodded. I walked to the front with trembling hands and connected my laptop to the presentation screen. Douglas watched me like I was a threat, which I suppose I was. 3 nights ago, I received an anonymous email containing these documents. I began. My voice shook but held. I verified their authenticity through header information and cross-references. They appeared to be internal documents from Douglas' computer. I pulled up the first document, Douglas Complete Restructuring Plan. 8 positions eliminated, all long-term staff. 6 new positions created, 5 already assigned to his former colleagues. The board members leaned forward, reading carefully. This wasn't presented to us, Susan said slowly. I clicked to the next document. The budget projection showing increased costs rather than savings. David, the tech entrepreneur, frowned. This contradicts what you told us last month, Douglas. Those are preliminary drafts, Douglas said quickly. Not final plans. I was still working through scenarios. I clicked again. Douglas' employment contract with the restructuring bonus highlighted. $50,000 contingent on restructuring completion within 6 months. The room went very quiet. You have a financial incentive to eliminate positions, Susan asked, her tone sharp. Douglas stood abruptly. Those are stolen confidential documents. Where did you get those? This is a violation of privacy and possibly illegal. I demand to know who's sabotaging my leadership. But I kept going. I showed the news articles about his previous organizations. The pattern of arrive, disrupt, install new team, depart. The trail of damaged non-profits in his wake. Why weren't we informed about these 8 planned terminations? One board member asked. Why does your budget show increased administrative costs when you promised efficiency savings? Another demanded. Douglas tried to recover. You're being manipulated? Can't you see? Mindy is desperate to keep her job. Shall say anything, show anything. This is character assassination. That's when Howard finally spoke. I'd like to add some context, he said quietly, but the room fell silent immediately. He stood and walked to the table, placing his own folder in front of Susan. After the all-staff meeting, I made some calls to Douglas' previous employers. I reached board members and former colleagues. The pattern Mindy showed you is accurate. 3 organizations in 5 years. Same approach each time. Arrives with impressive credentials and promises. Eliminates experienced staff. Installs new management team. Claims success and transformation. Departs within 18 months. The organizations are left destabilized. He opened his folder. At his last position, a community health nonprofit, his restructuring reduced direct services by 40%, while administrative costs increased by 60%. They lost 2 major grants because program instability violated funding requirements. They're still recovering 3 years later. David pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. After a moment, he looked up. I'm looking at public records and tax filings from his previous nonprofit. Howard's right. Service delivery collapsed after restructuring. They had to lay off additional staff a year after Douglas left just to stay afloat. Another board member asked, why wasn't this caught in our search process? Susan looked uncomfortable. Douglas came highly recommended from a consulting firm. We prioritized his MBA and corporate experience. We should have dug deeper into his nonprofit track record. The board members began talking among themselves, voices rising. Douglas saw the room turning against him. "I don't have to sit here and be insulted," he said. "You clearly don't want real leadership. You want someone to maintain the status quo and tell you comfortable lies." He grabbed his binder and started toward the door. "Douglas." Howard's voice stopped him. "If you leave this room now, it will be considered a resignation." Douglas paused at the door, hand on the handle. He was trapped. Leave and quit. Stay and face consequences. After a long moment, he turned back. "Sit down," Susan said. Her voice had gone cold. "We're not finished." Douglas sat back down, but the confidence that had characterized his first months was completely gone. Susan addressed him directly. "We need to discuss your immediate future with this organization." What followed was a 2-hour executive session. Mindy and Howard were asked to step outside. We sat in the hallway, me on a bench, Howard in a chair nearby. I couldn't stop shaking. Adrenaline coursed through my system like electricity. "You did the right thing speaking up," Howard said gently. "I was terrified," I admitted. "I'm still terrified. That's when courage matters most." He paused, looking at me with kind eyes. "Can I tell you something, Mindy? That grant condition wasn't the Mercer Foundation's idea. It was mine." I stared at him. "What? 2 years ago? I saw you stay until midnight helping a student apply to 17 colleges. You didn't know I was there. I had come back to get something from my old office. I watched you through your office window, patiently filling out form after form with this girl, explaining financial aid options, encouraging her when she got frustrated. You weren't performing for anyone. You were just there, fully present, caring genuinely. That's when I knew your position needed protection." Tears filled my eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep being exactly who you are," Howard replied. "The foundation needs people who understand that our work is about humans, not just metrics." Finally, the boardroom door opened. Susan emerged alone, her face unreadable. "Mindy, Howard, please come back in." We returned to find Douglas sitting stiffly, his face pale. Susan remained standing. "Effective immediately. Douglas Brennan is on administrative leave pending investigation. We're suspending all restructuring plans until we conduct a thorough review. We'll be interviewing staff about the work environment under his leadership. We'll also be auditing all expenditures and contracts established during his tenure." Douglas started to speak, but Susan held up her hand. "You're dismissed, Douglas. Someone from HR will contact you about the investigation process." He stood slowly, looked around the room at faces that had once supported him, and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Susan then turned to me. "Mindy, I owe you an apology. We failed you. We hired someone without proper vetting. We allowed him to publicly humiliate you. We didn't protect you the way we should have." The other board members murmured agreement. For the next hour, the board asked me detailed questions about my work. I showed them photos on my phone from program sites. I shared stories about specific young people. I talked about the relationships that made everything work, the partnerships with community centers, the trust we had built over years, the systems that looked simple from outside but were actually complex and fragile. One board member, a woman named Carol, who had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, spoke up. "I've been on this board for 3 years and I've never visited a program site. I'm ashamed to admit that. We've been disconnected from the actual work," David agreed. "We got seduced by corporate language and impressive presentations. We forgot what we're really here to do." The investigation took 2 weeks. During that time, more problems emerged. Multiple staff members reported that Douglas had made inappropriate comments to female employees. Others described intimidation tactics when they questioned his decisions. The finance team discovered he had used the foundation's credit card for personal expenses, including expensive dinners and gifts that violated policy. Douglas was terminated for cause, no severance. He threatened legal action, but his lawyers apparently advised him that his case was weak given the documented evidence. He left quietly, though not before sending a bitter email to several board members blaming everyone but himself. During those 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. The board asked me to help oversee daily operations temporarily until they hired a new director. I hesitated, doubting my capabilities. But Patricia encouraged me. You can do this, Mindy. You've been quietly leading for years. Now it's just official. I discovered she was right. I coordinated with department heads, helped restore staff morale that had been shattered by Douglas reign, and kept programs running smoothly. I realized I had leadership abilities I had never acknowledged in myself. I had been so focused on supporting others that I had diminished my own value. The board brought in an interim executive director named Sarah Brighton, a nonprofit veteran in her 50s with decades of mission-driven leadership experience. Sarah immediately visited all 12 program sites, meeting kids and staff. She implemented regular feedback sessions where employees could voice concerns without fear. Board members committed to quarterly site visits so they would stay connected to actual program work. But more importantly, I underwent my own transformation. I realized I had been complicit in my own diminishment. I never advocated for myself. I always downplayed my contributions. I accepted being overlooked and undervalued because I didn't want to seem arrogant or demanding. Douglas' attack, as painful as it was, forced me to recognize and claim my actual worth. Marcus and the other coordinators noticed the change. You're different, Marcus told me one afternoon. More confident. It's good. 6 weeks after Douglas' departure, the board called me in for a meeting. Susan smiled, something I rarely saw from her. Mindy, we'd like to offer you a promotion. Director of Community Programs. It comes with a raise to $95,000 annually, expanded authority, and a seat at leadership meetings. We realize we've been undervaluing your work for years. We'd like to correct that. I accepted. Not just because of the money, though being able to afford a reliable car was wonderful, but because I finally believed I deserved it. Then, 2 months after everything had settled, I received a LinkedIn message from a woman named Jennifer. I saw Douglas Brennan used to work at your foundation, she wrote. I need to warn you about something. Jennifer had worked at one of Douglas' previous organizations. She was eliminated during his restructuring there. After he left, we discovered he had been creating fake consultant positions and paying vendors that didn't exist. He was embezzling money through the chaos of restructuring. We reported it, but he had already moved to his next job before prosecution could proceed. My blood ran cold. I immediately contacted Susan and the board. We brought in forensic auditors to examine Douglas' spending more carefully. They found exactly what Jennifer had warned about. 2 consulting contracts totaling $75,000 paid to a shell company Douglas controlled. Fake invoices. False documentation. The foundation recovered most of the funds through insurance and legal action. We reported everything to law enforcement. Douglas faced criminal charges. What had started as me defending my job had exposed actual criminal activity. I had literally saved the foundation from an embezzler. 6 months after that horrible Monday morning meeting, I stood in front of 40 young people at our annual celebration event. These were our program graduates, kids who had made it through high school against odds that would have broken many adults. 12 were heading to college. Others had been accepted to vocational programs or secured good jobs. Every single one had a path forward. I was supposed to give a short speech about the program's success, but as I looked at their faces, many of whom I had personally mentored, I realized I needed to say something different. Your value isn't determined by people who don't understand your journey, I began. Sometimes the people who should protect you will fail you. Sometimes those in authority will try to diminish you, dismiss you, or call you obsolete. Several kids nodded. They knew about being underestimated, but your worth remains constant regardless of who sees it or acknowledges it. Eventually, truth emerges, not always as quickly as we'd like, not always in the ways we expect, but it does emerge. Hold on to who you are during the difficult middle parts. That's what matters most. After the ceremony, Howard pulled me aside. We stood in the hallway while families celebrated in the main room. I want to explain something, he said. When I negotiated that grant condition protecting your position, I wasn't just protecting a job. I was protecting what you represent. People like you are rare in any organization, people who do the work for the right reasons, who show up not for recognition but because they genuinely care. The foundation's greatest asset isn't our budget or our facilities. It's people like you who understand that our work is about humans, not numbers. I hugged him. tears streaming down my face. "You believed in me before I believed in myself. Now you do," he replied. "That's what matters." Later that week, Patricia and I had coffee together. We were peers now, both directors in our respective areas. "I need to apologize again," she said. "I should have fought harder for you when Douglas was building his case. I was afraid of losing my own position. I chose self-preservation over standing up for what was right." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I understand. Fear makes us all smaller than we are. But we can choose to be braver next time. That's growth." One of the board members, the tech entrepreneur David, who had initially supported Douglas, reached out to me personally. "I was wrong," he said bluntly. "I was impressed by confidence and credentials instead of character and competence. Will you help us develop better hiring practices? We need someone who understands what actually matters." I agreed. Together, we created new protocols that required candidates to visit program sites, meet frontline staff, and demonstrate understanding of mission work rather than just business theory. Marcus and the other site coordinators hosted a surprise appreciation lunch for me on a random Thursday. They presented me with a framed collage of photos from all 12 program sites, along with handwritten thank you notes from kids in our programs. Marcus made a short speech. "You taught us that leadership is about service, not authority. Douglas taught us what leadership should never be. Both lessons were valuable, but yours matters more." I hung that collage in my office where I could see it every day. On a quiet Friday afternoon, sitting alone in my office and looking at those photos, I reflected on the entire journey, from humiliation to vindication, from victim to victor. The pain had been real and deep, but it had also been necessary. I had been comfortable being invisible, avoiding conflict, downplaying my own achievements. Douglas' attack forced me to see myself clearly and claim my value. Sometimes your enemies teach you more than your friends. That's an uncomfortable truth, but it's truth nonetheless. I also understood now that organizations reflect their leaders' values. Douglas' approach wasn't just bad management. It was morally corrupt. He taught people to compete rather than collaborate, to value image over substance, to fear rather than trust. He created an environment where loyalty was punished and opportunism was rewarded. Under Sarah's leadership, with the board's renewed commitment, we were building something different. A culture that valued actual impact over impressive presentations, that prioritized people over metrics, that understood mission work required different measures of success than corporate profit models. 3 months later, I visited Jasmine, one of my original mentees who was now a college sophomore. She was studying social work, inspired by her own experiences in our program. We met at a coffee shop near her campus, and she was glowing with excitement about her classes and her future. "I want to do what you do," she told me. "I want to work with kids who need someone to believe in them. You changed my life, Mindy. I want to change lives too." This, I realized, is the real measure of impact. Not budget numbers or efficiency metrics. Lives touched, dreams enabled, futures opened. One person investing in another person, creating ripples that extend far beyond what we can see or measure. "The work we do matters," I told her. "Never let anyone tell you otherwise. Never let anyone make you feel obsolete for doing work that can't be reduced to a PowerPoint slide." As I drove home that evening, I thought about everything I had learned. Your value doesn't depend on who recognizes it. Speaking truth is terrifying but necessary. Organizations are only as healthy as their integrity. Sometimes being called obsolete forces you to prove you're essential. But most importantly, I learned that real leadership isn't about having the loudest voice or the most impressive credentials. It's about showing up every day for work that matters, for people who need you, with integrity no one can question. When you do that consistently, the right people will notice, and the wrong people will eventually expose themselves. My career didn't end that Monday morning in the conference room. It actually began, because I finally stopped apologizing for the space I occupy and the work I do. I stopped waiting for permission to be valuable. I simply was. The Sterling Youth Foundation continues to thrive. Our programs have expanded to 2 additional counties, and eventually, I was promoted again to Vice President of Programs, overseeing all youth initiatives across the foundation. All because I survived the worst moment and discovered I was stronger than I knew. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where someone in authority tried to diminish your value or contributions? How did you respond? Did you find your voice, or do you wish you had spoken up? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else who's facing a similar challenge right now. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like. It helps more people find these stories and realize they're not alone in their struggles. Subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories about overcoming workplace injustice, finding your strength, and standing up for what matters. And please share this video with someone who might need to hear that their value doesn't depend on who recognizes it. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that you are not obsolete. No matter what anyone says, your work matters. Your presence matters. You matter. Keep showing up with integrity, and eventually, truth will find its way to the surface. Stay strong, and remember that sometimes our biggest challenges become our greatest transformations.